Okay, well, it is 6 o'clock on the west coast of Canada here, so we're going to get started with this week's Excel track for the Vancouver Power BI and Modern Excel User Group. As always, folks, the meeting is being recorded, so just make sure that that you are aware of that if you do decide to come off mic and participate at all. But before we start into the presentation, I'm just going to go through and deal with a little bit of housekeeping slides along the way. So today, well, we have started. It is 6 p.m. on the West Coast, so I'm just going to give you just a quick intro, couple of slides here, and then we'll get into the feature presentation, which is me, and then we'll run to. I don't know how long we're going to run to be honest with you, because this particular presentation is a brand new first run for me. So while I've practiced a little bit here, it could be between 45 minutes, it could be between an hour and a half, depending on what happens. So if we end up running a little bit long and you can't stick around, as always, it is recorded. So hopefully, you know, you'll be able to pick it up online at a later date. I do want to say a big thanks to the sponsors. Excelguru is my company that organizes and pulls all these things together, and Skillwave.training is our training division. We have all kinds of awesome online and coach training as well available at Skillwave. So if you're interested in learning more and bettering your business intelligence skills, please check us out. Microsoft, big thanks to them. I'm actually just received my 15th straight MVP award this year, which is a pretty big honor. And Microsoft obviously helps us out, provides me the software to make these things happen and whatnot. So a big thanks to them for that. I also want to throw a quick note out to Monkey Tools, which is my Excel add-in, which allows you to build better business intelligence models faster. Just one of the other products that we actually have at Excelguru. Speaking of Monkey Tools, I have actually mentioned this previously, but I do want to make sure that people are aware of this. We now have ability to import models from Power BI to Excel. It's no longer a one-way thing where you go from Excel to Power BI. You can now get them back into Excel so you can work with them if you're like me and Excel is your favorite program for working with that. So there is a blog post where I actually demoed that feature on Reed Haven's webcast. You can actually pick that up there. That's just one of the many things that Monkey Tools actually does. Our next meetups are going to be coming up. I'm super excited to be welcoming my friend Matt Allington on Thursday, July 22nd. We will be again starting in our usual time slot, 6 p.m. on the West Coast. So Matt's going to be doing this in his morning for Australia. He's going to be talking about thinking about DAX functions differently, which is going to be a great talk, and I'm super looking forward to that. Our Excel track for August 5th, we are working on the presenter right now. So we're hoping that we're actually going to be getting someone from Microsoft, but I don't actually have details on that yet. So for sure, it will be something really cool and interesting by someone really awesome. We know that, but further details will be forthcoming as soon as we get them. I just want to let people know that if you are really interested in mastering your business intelligence game, it is not too late to join the current semester for the Self-Service Business Intelligence Bootcamp at Skillwave. You can find the link here. We are actually kicking off a new semester on Monday. This is a massive program, about 33 hours of training and coaching. I actually just did a 2-hour Ask Me Anything session with my crew yesterday. A lot of fun. Learn all kinds of good stuff in here, and you know, if you're interested, you should definitely check it out. So you can find it at that link there. Later, can I add links to the articles about importing from Power BI to Excel? There's a summary page. You know what? The slide deck here is already posted on our website, so you can always download it from there. Ron, I know that that you're having some challenges with the downloads on those. I believe that working in private or incognito should work. If not, you can always post back, and I will email you the links to those things as well. So. All right. Last thing I just want to throw out, if you are interested in being part of the speaking crew for our meetup, please drop us a note, fill out this little survey here, and we will get in touch with you. We love welcoming new speakers to our platform. So that is our welcome and intro for today. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to get rid of that particular slide deck. We're going to close that one down, and I'm going to move over to the slide deck for today's presentation. So we're going to go from right here. And this is an unusual move for me, but there is a link here, and I apologize that it's not shorter than this. Unfortunately, OneDrive gives me these massive links, but I did want to get it recorded into the video here. So the example and slides are available for this presentation if people want to grab them. I'm going to go and copy paste this guy into the chat right now. So if anybody does want to download them, you don't have to look too hard. It's right there. We will also post this on the meetup group later as well. But today's presentation is going to be on creating unpivotable charts. Before I dive into it, I am going to turn my camera off just to make sure that I maximize my bandwidth here. Oh, hey, Christian's here. And thank you, Christian, for the kind words on the self-service BI bootcamp. I very much appreciate that. All right, I'm turning off my camera to maximize my bandwidth up here. I want to let you all know here, this is a brand new first run presentation that I'm doing here, which means it's either going to be awesome or it's going to crash and burn really badly. Nah, it's not going to crash and burn. We're going to be okay with this. But I honestly don't know how long this is going to run, as I said. So it could be 45, could be an hour and a half. We'll see what happens. It depends on how slick I am, how much I mess up, and how many questions you guys have along the way here. So in the meantime, let's go and have some fun with it. We'll take a look and see what we can do here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm going to go through this one, I think, fairly quickly. My name is Ken. I am a fellow of the Chartered Professional Accountants in Canada. Originally started as a certified management accountant, but we've amalgamated into one designation. I do own the Excelguru.ca website, blog, and forum. So just a nice little help site that we have that's dedicated to helping people get the most that they can out of Excel. I am one of the founding partners of skillwave.training, already mentioned, which is that site to really get the best business intelligence training that you have out there. I've also been recognized as an MVP as of 7 days ago for the 15th straight time, 15 years, which is a huge honor and something I'm super proud of. So it's pretty cool stuff. And I'm also an author of 3 books. Now, for the first time ever, I've actually updated the image of the cover of the new book onto my slide here. And I know that there are a few people out there who have probably been waiting for this book for a long time. And this is actually really cool because the first book was on Ribbon X that nobody wanted to read. The second book was called M is for Data Monkey, which sort of picked up its own crew of people and fans because it is one of the books we were really hard on with Power Query. Master Your Data is the follow-up for M is for Data Monkey, and as many of you know, for those of you who've actually signed up to purchase it in advance or whatever else, that book has been delayed several times and whatnot. Well, I got to tell you, I'm super pleased here. What you're looking at right here, this is the PDF of the draft of the entire book. This guy is going to be coming out. We got all kinds of cool stuff. I'm actually super stoked about this chapter here on different ways to merge data. We cover fuzzy matching and all kinds of stuff, and my calendar stuff. I got stuff on allocations. It's turned into a 384-page book. This thing is absolutely massive, and we are intending to send this to the printers next Thursday. So it should actually be out before the date that it actually says on Amazon. So we're super stoked about that. It is finally coming for all of you who have been patiently waiting for it. And if you haven't, well, if you haven't been patiently waiting for it or impatiently waiting for it or waiting for it at all, we're super pleased. We've worked really hard on it, and we hope that you guys are going to enjoy it when you get it out there. In addition to that, of course, I'm a software developer. We published the Monkey Tools add-in for Excel. I am going to just let you know here that that you are going to see a brief appearance of Monkey Tools today. It will show up in the presentation. The target audience for this tool is around Excel users who are building models with Power Query and Power Pivot or need to audit models to see from others. What I'm going to show you today is actually a feature that we're working on, although it's only going to make a brief appearance in the presentation because I'm going to show you how to do everything manually. There's the pricing model for Monkey Tools. You can find out more about it here. But as I say, the big thing that I want you to be aware of on this presentation is that Monkey Tools is just around to make your life easier. I always want to make sure that we're showing you guys the full way to do this the manual way so that you don't actually have to buy my software if you don't need to. Having said that, everything that I'm going to show you that Monkey Tools touches on today is always going to be included in the free license, including the new feature that will be coming out. So nobody has to pay for anything you're going to see today at all. Okay, so let's talk about the subject that we're here to talk about today. So I called this little presentation something about creating unpivotable charts. Now, what the heck is an unpivotable chart? I have this habit of making up my own words for some of these things as I go along. So the concept of an unpivotable chart is something like this. I've got a nice little table of data here. This is actually some data that I actually stripped out of something I used to actually write Master Your Data. We did a timing of a whole bunch of different runs of buffered versus unbuffered queries to check out performance. So I've got this data, and what I wanted to do is I wanted to go and chart it in a way that makes some sense. So I wanted to use a box and whisker chart, something that looks like this. And this allows me, if you're not familiar with these, to get some statistics around things. It can track the mean and the median. It shows me the different quartiles of the refresh time, as well as the maximum, the minimum, and then outliers as well, so I can sort of see how things perform on average. And if you look at that chart, you can say, wow, that buffer, there was really very little variation in the refresh times on those, and they're pretty fast at less than 10 seconds. Where the unbuffered versions were anywhere between 14 and 18 seconds with a lot of variation. So this is an interesting chart that gives me a lot of value. Well, the problem is that I grabbed all this data and I threw it into the data model. So how do you get your data out of the data model? Of course, you put it into a pivot table. And then you try and go and build a box and whisker chart on it, and you get this awesome little message that says, you can't create this chart type with data inside a pivot table. Please select a different chart type, or my favorite, copy the data outside the pivot table. This is what I refer to as an unpivotable chart. You basically can't create it against the pivot table. Okay, so that's the sort of the background for what we're actually looking at here. So which charts are unpivotable? And the answer to this one, unfortunately, is far too many. Here's the list. Okay. Now, when you actually go and take a look at that, basically what we're sort of looking at here is that I would say greater than half, almost 2/3 of the charts in Excel now are not able to be built against the pivot table. And that really is kind of sad. I mean, this is a very, very useful tool that we actually use for a lot of reasons. And here we've got a whole bunch of charts that the Excel teams obviously work really hard to build that aren't available to us. And actually, probably, to be honest with you, the one that shocked me the most when I was going through and pulling this all together was the scatter plot. And I mean, I don't use scatter plots all the time, but scatter plots have been around in Excel since they were there since before Excel 97, and yet they're not supported in the pivot table. It's really, really shocking to me. Anyhow, the big question for us on this one here is, I mean, why do we care? Like, what does it matter if you can't actually use these charts for pivot tables in the first place? Well, the reality is that pivot tables and pivot charts are the primary vehicles for data model reporting. If your data is living in a worksheet, you typically have different avenues you can go to deal with things. So your pivot table, if your data is in a worksheet, your pivot table is a summary of that data. It already exists in the worksheet. So if you got to report on something differently, you can always report against the original table. But once that data is in the data model, things get a little bit trickier because you can't actually necessarily talk to it the same way. And that's the big issue. So while many users won't really care about this, if you work with a data model, you care a lot because bigger data sets actually increase the need for more robust charting options. Reality is bar and column charts, line charts, they don't work for everything. Sure, they work. And yes, they're simple and they're easy to read and they can convey a lot of information, but I can get a lot more information in the data set I just showed you out of a box and whisker chart than I can by creating a whole series of column charts or bar charts or line charts. So this is where we actually want to get into being able to use these new and different chart types or even custom chart types with our data model data. And the question is, how do we actually go about doing it? Now, the good news is that we can use these charts. We just need to get a little creative with how we actually get in there and access them. And that's what the thrust of this presentation is going to be about here, is we're going to be moving into demo time and we're going to play around with a few different things where we can actually show you a couple of routes to actually go and get data out of the data model. Okay, so I have built this presentation just for reference in a way that sort of lends to telling the story and breaking things down a little bit differently. So I'm not promising to do everything in the most efficient way. Okay? That's not the point of what we're dealing with here. I also do not promise to use beautiful, effective visuals that make everybody sit up and go, oh, that's amazing. As a matter of fact, if you hate round charts, I'm going to horrify you because I'm going to make the ultimate pie chart today. Well, actually, I'm not. It's going to be somewhat slightly different. But the reality is that this is not about data visualization best practices. This is about extracting data from the data model. That's what it's all about. Okay, so keep that in mind as we're going through here. If you look at it and the chart makes you shudder, don't worry about it. Think about how you can apply that to your own chart and actually make things work. Okay? So before we dive in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this little example here called charting refresh time. And it's not a super complicated thing right now. What I've done is I've got a whole bunch of test data that I actually ran for the example that I was using in Master Your Data. So basically what we've got here is we've got two runs. Actually, I ran 20 different refreshes, and I've tried these in a variety of different ways with buffering or buffering active or inactive, as well as with privacy active or inactive. And I've got all of these things stored into this one table. Okay, so you'll see for every test run, it shows up 4 times in here. But the only ones I actually really care about are the ones that have privacy off and the difference between buffered and unbuffered. I am using Power Query to bring this data into the data model, and you'll see that the Power Query structured chain on the right-hand side, once it refreshes here, has a few different components to it. The main thrust of it is that this table here runs through raw data. It goes into staging, where I make some changes to it and do a little bit of filtering before running it into results in an unpivoted format. Okay, so that's and I mean, it's very similar to what we actually have in this case. But inside staging, I'm actually using something here to filter it down to certain maximum runs. So it'll actually filter anything previous to this and actually remove some different components if I don't actually need them. Now, the data model behind the scenes on this one is really not complicated at all. There's one table. That's it. Okay, so here we go. One single fact table, and it has one measure called time S, and that basically is just summing the refresh time. That's it. Okay, nothing super complicated here. But what I want to do is I actually want to build some charts in order to build up and analyze my data. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and I'm actually going to end up building 4 comparisons here to sort of show you how things work or don't work as the case may be. And I'm going to start by building a basic pivot chart. All right, so this is something that is, something that anybody can do. So we're going to grab some data from the data model, and I'm going to go and put this on an existing worksheet. There we are. And from my results table, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be charting the time, and I think I'm going to go and put on rows, we're going to put the test case number, and on columns, we're going to throw in the buffering. So we're going to get a side-by-side sequence here, but it's got grand totals on it. It's got a grand total on the bottom as well. I don't need those. So I'm going to go and choose my grand totals. We're going to turn them off for both of these guys. And now I'm going to go and make a pivot chart. So we're going to go up to PivotTable Tools, Analyze, Pivot Chart. And I'm just going to grab one of these guys here. Okay, so there's a standard little line chart. Click OK. And of course, it's a pivot chart. So I got to do all the things to make it palatable to look at, including the very first thing is turning off these horrible, ugly field buttons that are like so 1990. So we'll get rid of those. We'll set the legend down to the bottom where it should be. So we'll go there. That looks better. And of course, we'll add the essential piece of infrastructure that is missing on every pivot chart that gets created, and that is a chart title. I believe they fixed every other chart inside Excel, but only pivot charts come out without a chart title by default. Really frustrating. And here we go. I'm just going to go and name this guy Pivot. Right? And then we'll take this chart and we're going to move it up into the top here. I'll just snap it into the grid. So there we go. We've got a nice little pivot chart. Okay. So this is obviously fairly straightforward, fairly easy. This is the experience that pretty much most of us would expect when working with a chart, except for the fact that we got to customize it so much to get it to where we are. The nice thing, of course, being that it's based on a pivot, we can actually go and add timelines and splicers, anything against the data model that we actually want to use in order to filter and slice it the way we want. And of course, if the data gets updated or it grows, we know the chart is going. Love it. Fantastic. Now, at this point, I want to get into a world that's slightly more complicated. What I want to do is I also want to build, to go side by side with this, a box and whisker chart to look at the same data, because I want to look at it in different ways. This is interesting, but what I want to know is, can you give me a little bit more about the variation? Are there outliers? Are there other statistical things that I'm looking at? So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to this blank cell here, and I'm going to start the way that any normal user would. So I'm going to go over to my pivot tables and choose some data model. Go. And right inside here, I'm going to try and build the layout that I know is required for the box and whisker chart. So that layout is going to end up looking like this. We're going to put our times on our values, And in this case, we're going to go test and buffering are both going to be on rows. I'm going to make some design changes here. So we're going to go to our report layout. We'll show it in tabular form. And then we're going to go to the report layout and repeat all item labels to fill that down. And then once again, we're going to take this and we're going to turn the grand totals off. All right. Now, that looks pretty good. I'm happy with the way the data is all structured here. So naturally, at this point, I'm going to say, great, I want these two columns here. So I want to go and put this into a nice little box. We'll say insert. We're going to go up to, where's my box and whiskers? Under here, under my statistical chart, and box and whiskers. And we get the dreaded error message that says, hey, you can't do that because your data is inside a pivot table. So your choices are select a different chart type. Thanks, that's super helpful because I was going for a box and whisker chart. I don't really want a column chart or a line chart or anything else. I want this chart. Or here's a helpful suggestion, copy the data outside of the pivot table. So you know what? Let's try that first. So we'll go and we'll grab our table, Control C, right click, Control V. All right, cool. We've now got our data here. There we are, all of the same data, no big deal. So now we can go and we can grab all of this stuff here and we'll go insert and we'll come over here and build our box and whisker chart. Now, for anybody who's done this before, you're already shuddering going, no, you don't want to do this. But you all know as well as I do that we run, oops, that's a little weird. What happened there? You all know as well as I do that we run into this kind of thing all the time. I managed to eat my title on that one. That's pretty good. All right. So this is why I'm actually replicating the behavior on this one, because I know that this is not actually abnormal at all. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to rename this as static. Which kind of gives away what the problem is if you haven't seen this before. All right. So we've got a nice box and whisker chart. So I got my data out of the data model. I've got it onto a worksheet. I've been able to chart it. Fantastic. Except that, of course, now we're going to run into a problem when we do something. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to go back to raw data, and I'm going to grab these temporary values right here, Control C. I'm going to paste them over my refresh times here. We're going to update it. Got a new value coming in. And now we'll come back and hit refresh all. And at this point in time, it's going to go through and it's going to do its refresh. And what we should see is that our pivot chart over here, the lines just became further apart. We've updated, our buffered time has dropped and our unbuffered time has actually gone up slightly. We can see that the source of this particular table here has also updated. So that one's all good. And yet our chart over here, of course, did not change. And the reason it didn't change is because these were just a static paste of values. So it's not going to update. The sad thing is, I already get into a scenario here, or I see this all the time, where if you copy, you get the people will come back here and do a paste special in order to update this. So this is exactly what they'll do. They'll create the pivot table, they'll copy paste special as values, they'll go in there and they'll build their chart, and when they do a refresh, they'll go back, copy paste the pivot table, and paste it over top of the other one. Does it work? Yes. Is it manual? Yes. Does it get forgotten? Absolutely. Do you put the wrong report in front of your boss? You bet you do, right? I mean, it's got all of those particular kinds of problems. Ron, you asked, can you paste special with link? I got to be honest with you, I've never actually tried that. And to be 100% honest, I'm not even going to bother. And the reason being is because there's better ways of dealing with that. I'm not a huge fan of creating a pivot table and landing it to a worksheet and then trying to build things that target the pivot table. And the reason being is because if the pivot table starts to expand, at that point in time, generally, no matter what you've actually picked up, it's not going to expand with it if you're driving things based on formulas. The other thing that I ran into with this as I was actually playing around and trying to experiment is I thought, oh, I'm going to be really clever with this thing, and I'm actually going to try and feed some of these charts using dynamic arrays, and it wasn't this particular chart I was trying with, so that might work here. But what I actually discovered is that a lot of these the newer chart types, what we refer to as Ivy charts, the ones that came out after Excel 2016, they don't actually support the dynamic arrays as inputs either in occasion. So it becomes a bigger challenge here. So this obviously isn't going to work with us. This is not an awesome solution at the end of the day, and yet I can pretty much say with confidence that anybody who has run into, or anybody that is intermediate to advanced user who has other users in their organization that may not be as intermediate as advanced, if you either haven't done yourself or seen someone update PivotTable and copy and paste the results to get somewhere, you haven't seen enough Excel solutions. It happens all the time, right? It's just that's the sort of the standard way that people actually go and try and deal with this. So I want a better solution. I want something that's actually going to work. When I hit the refresh, I don't want to have to get back into a manual process. Manual and can do not go together. This is just not the way that things work. So we're going to try something a little bit different. One of the cool and interesting things that we can actually do with a pivot table that is based against a data model is we have the ability to convert it into a formula-based set of data. In order to do this, what you can do is you can go to the Pivot Table Analyze tab, and if you're inside your pivot table, under OLAP Tools, you get the option to convert to formulas. This option only appears if you're actually working with something that is based on a cube-based data set like our pivot is. So basically, we're going to go convert to formulas right now, and it's going to convert the entire table into a formula-based set. So this is no longer a pivot table. Now, there are a couple of things here that I actually do want to look at, though, because the most important thing for me here is what's actually going on in this area here with my time that's being returned. And if we actually take a look here, you can see that we have a formula up in the top. It says equals cube value, and then it refers to the this workbook data model, and then it's got H18 and I17. And we can see that the H18 is pointing over here, and I17 is pointing over here. Now, as a rule of thumb, when I make cube formulas, I always go through the process of what I call flattening them. I cannot stand having a chained cube formula that reads from cube formulas in other cells that read from cube formulas in other cells. I just don't like that. It gives me much more power, it's much more robust if I can flatten these down so that the cube formula exists in one cell and I can feed it dynamically based on text-based data. So to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through the process of modifying this cube function. The very first thing I do when I hit a cube function is I actually expand my formula bar. Okay, so that's where I go and hit this little plus here. You can also make it a little bit taller if you need to by just dragging it. Okay, and I'm going to come up here right after the comma, and I'm going to press Alt-Enter. And I'm going to go here after this comma, and I'm going to put in an Alt-Enter as well. Okay, so I break each of these components down into separate lines. And I'm just going to hit Enter on that one now, and then I'm going to go back up to it. Okay, so it always starts with equals cube value. That's what's going to get the value of the measure out. Okay, it always starts with this workbook data model, or sorry, I say dot. That's the way I think about it. But it always starts with this workbook data model. And then it actually talks about the cube members that we want. And you can put in as many cube members as you want to filter your data. Okay, so you can kind of look at this right now as saying, read from the data model. What do you want to get back? Well, let me tell you. So I'm going to go and take a look at time first. And inside time, we can see that we've got cube member, this workbook data model, measures time S. Now, time is the name of the measure itself from the pivot table. Measures is obviously just a collection. Okay? So that's just the name of measures. It's always measures. I didn't store it on a measures table, and I should actually probably just go and prove that out if I go and click back in a pivot table over here for a second, and we go back and take a look at that. My measure time is actually stored in the results table, not a table called measures. Okay? So that's important to realize. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the formula, and it was the red one. I'm just going to paste that formula right in here. Okay, so we're replacing the reference to it. So cube member, this workbook data model, measures, always measures, and then whatever the name of the measure is, time S. I'm now going to go through. Now, I could do a couple things here. I can either hit Enter. I'm actually going to do an Alt-Enter on this one again. I'm going to move my last paren down to the very end on this one. I always like to start my cube value like this workbook data model, put all of the cube members, and then have the final parenthesis on it to balance. I kind of wish, to be honest with you, there was a way to automatically indent these formulas inside the Excel user interface. Keep threatening to, I know there's actually a few add-ins that actually do that kind of work, but keep threatening to actually put something like that in Monkey Tools at some point in time too, but haven't done so yet. At any rate, what we've got now, we've actually broken this down a little bit. I now need to go and get the one that is feeding from the other cell, buffer. So I'm going to go and grab that. A little bit longer. And grab this and put it in place here. Okay. Control V, and now I can hit enter, and this is actually pretty good. It looks like it's all okay here. What I want to do at this point, though, is I actually want to make this a little bit more dynamic, because right now this is referring to test 01, which is over here, and it's hard-coded into the formula. And it's referring to buffered, which is over here, but it's hard-coded into the formula. So what I really want to do is I actually want to do this. I want to say quote, we're going to end off our text, and I'm going to grab this and quote, and then for buffered, I'm going to do the exact same thing, except a different cell. So I want to make this dynamic. Now, before I press enter on this, I want you to know that I have typed this several times. I have looked at this in detail. I am 100% confident that what I have written and typed right now live in front of you is 100% right. Okay? There's no syntax error in the way that I've actually referred to those cells. And yet, when I hit enter, this formula will come up with an error. And there's a reason why this is actually happening here. It gives you all kinds of stuff. None of these things here are actually correct. Okay? The issue that we have in this is that, and it's maybe hard to see, but just for reference, if you have a mouse with a scroll wheel here, you can actually scroll the mouse wheel to roll in, or shift scroll to zoom in on Teams window if you want to see it. But right in here, there's a curly brace, and there's another one down here. Everything between the curly braces is being fed into this workbook cube member as an array. So it's a collection of multiple terms that's being fed in there. And the challenge is you cannot make an array dynamic. You have to actually feed it a static set. Now, can I still use this? I absolutely can. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go and grab this. I'm going to go Alt-Enter, and I'm going to paste this in here again. So I've got the same thing in twice. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to break the array. So I'm going to take away the first curly brace, and then I'm going to find the end of the first set for results right there with the comma. I'm going to go all the way to the curly brace here and delete it. And then on the next one, I'm going to come and say, okay, I've already got this one here with the G18. So I'm going to grab all of that from the curly brace all the way up to the first comma. And then I'm going to go and take out that last curly brace right there as well. So I've now broken it out to say, look, these are the three cube members that I'm interested in. I want to know where the test is equal to 01. I want to know where the buffering is equal to buffer. And I want the measure that equals time. Okay. So once I've got that all in place, I hit enter and I still got 7. Okay, this is cool because now I can do this. I can go Control C, Control Alt V, V. Okay, so that's basically the shortcut for copy, paste special values. At least it's the one that I use. Control C for copy. Control Alt V will bring me up the paste special dialog. V gives me values. Enter. Notice this is now text. There's no formula here, like there is here. This one is also text, unlike this guy here. Okay, and this one is a formula that's referring to these cells and is no longer referring to this guy here. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to say, let's copy this formula all the way down. Now, I find this interesting that this is still pointing to the individual cells, and it is actually reading them as textual values, despite the fact there are a bunch of cube formulas in there. But I don't actually want to see those there because that means that every time I do a refresh, these are all going to recalc, and I don't actually need that. I only need these guys to recalc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and say, hey, let's go and take this, Control C, Control Alt V, V, boom. All of those are values. This guy here is also a cube member formula, so I can do the same thing and lock that one in as text as well. Okay, so I've now got a table that is fairly flat, except that every one of these is pulling back against the data model, and every one of them is looking at the information that's being put on the side here. One more step that I'm going to do with this before I actually go and start charting it, and that is that I'm going to turn this into a table. There we go. We've got a nice little table here. And of course, as soon as you created a table, you should always go and name it. So I'm just going to call this one Box Whisker Data. How about that? There we are. Good name for anything. And now I'm just going to go and grab the data in these two columns here and insert. And there's my box and whisker. There it is. So I've now got one. Then I'm going to give a title of OLAP. And again, we're going to move this up into the top. We'll snap that into the grid there and there. And we should be able to see that these two charts are identical because the data is identical. Okay. But remember, this guy here had a problem, right? When we refreshed the data, we had to copy and paste from the pivot table to get it over on top of this one. So is this better? So let's go back here, grab this, paste. Okay, we'll come back over to the charts page, and now I'm going to refresh. If all goes well, what we should see is these two guys should become closer together over here. The chart redraws, and we can plainly see that our outlier, there's a little dot above versus the outlier that was a little dot below. So this has actually now gone back to what the original data set was, and you can see that it is dynamically updated from the data model to go and show us the current values. So this is definitely a superior technique to create a pivot table and copy and paste every time. So, Ron, back to the question of would you copy paste especially with a link? This is why I wouldn't. I just go straight in and use the data model in order to be able to do this. Now, is this perfect? And the answer is no. There's still a challenge that we actually have here, and it comes around this. Let's go back over here and let's increase the number of runs that are in the data model. Currently, I have 10, which returns 20 rows to the data model. So we're going to go back over here, and we're going to do a refresh all. Okay, so what we should see, if I go and change out here, is that we now have 30 rows loaded through the query. And everything refreshed. We've now got data sort of from trial 1 all the way through 15 here, but our chart did not change here at all. Reason being, we've only got 10 values. And this is one of the dangerous things that we end up dealing with is when we're working with OLAP formulas. As long as the cube members that we are using are dynamic enough to pick up new data, it's all good. The problem is that in all of these formulas here, one of the things that we've actually targeted in this is the test number. Well, that's the part that changed. So we don't get new rows added to our OLAP table. That doesn't work. It basically says, look, you told me that you want items 1 through 10. You wrote them into the cell. That's what you're going to get. I don't care if you got 15. I'm not putting them in there. This can be super, super handy for constraining things, but it's also a little bit limiting when you're trying to use OLAP in order to be able to pull these things out because new items that are in your dimensions or newly added items to your dimensional sets don't show up. So anything that goes into the axis, if it's going to expand, this is a problem. How do we fix it? Well, here's how we're going to fix it. We're going to grab this. And this is one of the reasons why I actually went and flattened all the formulas. I can copy that, paste it down the bottom, go to Control 8 in this case, because I got this set up exactly right for it. I'm going to replace all the zeros with 1, so I'll now have 11 through 15. There we go. And now we just want to check really quickly and make sure that these things here are still formulas that are pointing to the right cell. Okay, and they appear that they are. Oops, let's not do it that way, Ken. So if I go and take a look at this, yep, looks like they're all working here. Even though these are numbers, they're being one of the beautiful things about Excel is that implicit type conversion, so it treats it as text. And now if I go back up, we can see that my chart has indeed changed. I've got a couple of outliers over here on this guy here, and things look a little bit different. You know, I should also, actually, I meant to do this the other time as well here. Let me just make a quick change to the chart style so it's a little bit easier to read this. I find that the default colors in the box and whisker are actually a little bit aggressive, hard to see, so it works a little bit better when you make them a lighter color. All right. So the good things that happen in this, it updates from the data model and gets the most recent data. The bad thing is it doesn't expand with new data when new data points are added. Those can be both positive and negative depending on where you're actually looking. Now, I want to show another technique that actually works better for this data that will automatically expand as things go through. So here's what I want to actually go and deal with. I'm going to create a new technique that's going to actually do something different. Now, because I know my friend Christian is here and we actually had a conversation about this the other day. Christian, I'm going to do this the long way. This is not because it is the smart way, but it's because it actually demonstrates a point that is very important to actually realize about what's going on here. And then I will actually talk to you about how else we could do this. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to create a new query. Okay, I'm going to create a new blank query. I'm going to go blank query, right? So once we get in there, I'm going to make this super fast and simple. I'm going to give it a value of 1. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to click the to table button, turn it into a table, and now that's all I need to do with it. I'm going to go close and load to. And I'm going to load this guy to a table, and on the existing worksheet, I'm going to put it into Q17. I'm also going to add it to the data model. Okay, so now there we go. We can go in and drop this guy in here, and we get a nice little table to get this one to go. Daniel said for each member expressed in the cube value, we don't need to use a cube member formula, just need to enter the member expression directly, cube value, result tests, and whatnot. That's awesome. It would sure be nice if it actually coded that to begin with, wouldn't it? So great, I appreciate that, and that is something that I will take on board because that is something that I actually did not know. So there you go. Love it when I learn things in these things. Okay, I've got a table that's all hooked up here. It's loaded to the data model. It's loaded to the Excel worksheet. Here's the trick with this one. Right click, we go to table, edit DAX. Inside here, you want to change your command type to be DAX. And then within this, we can now go and we can write a DAX formula that starts with evaluate. Now, what I'm going to do with this one, I'm actually going to write a very specific DAX formula on this one here. I'm not going to do the easiest thing. I want to demonstrate something here. So we're going to go with a top N, and I'm going to go with 20, and I'm going to go with result. Okay. Why result? I'm going to use results here because results is the name of this table here that actually holds a whole bunch of my my information. Okay. So we're going to return the top 20 rows from that instead of the top 30. And when I say OK, what happens is it shifts my table, which drives me nuts. Let me just delete that and shift that back to the left. That's totally unnecessary, Excel. What I get is I get back an actual table directly from the data model of the results that we actually have there. So that's kind of nice because now I've got a table. What can I do with a table? Well, I can feed a table into one of these charts. So I'm just going to move some stuff around, though. So I'm just going to move back across to the left here. And I'm going to move the privacy column over here because I don't really need that. So once I've got these guys in place here, I can now go and say, give me this data. We're going to go insert. We're going to choose the box and whisker chart again. Okay. And I'm just going to go and rename this one here to DAX table. There we go. And now we will go and put that right over here. So we can see where it belongs. Awesome. There we go. So we've now got a DAX-based table that's actually returning our values. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to actually call out about this one before we actually sort of look at why this one is a little bit more robust than OLAP. And that is around this, the query. So when I originally created this DAX table, I created a query that loaded to the data model and to the worksheet. And the secret there is having a table in the worksheet that connects to the data model. I then changed the DAX signature of that table, which means I can now go and delete this query. I don't need it anymore, okay? And you'll notice that the table sticks around. The reason that that is the case is because this table was not bound to that query in any way. It was pointed against the data model. As a matter of fact, it's pointed against the results table in the data model. It's not even pointed at this results query. So if you wanted to do this faster, you wouldn't create a new query to do this. All you would have done is just said, hey, I'm going to grab any of the tables in the data model, right click, change the load to behavior, and add table to my data model connection and put it on the worksheet. That would have worked just fine. You don't have to create the new table. So that's the big thing to be aware of. But by creating that table separately, I just, it allowed me to actually delete it so you can show you that they're definitely not linked. What do you do if you want to make changes to this? Well, let's go back now, table, edit DAX. I'm going to take this one back now, and I'm actually going to remove the top N from it. We're just going to go and say evaluate results, give me the results of the entire table. And boom, you can see that the chart has now updated. If I were to go and set this color here, you can see that this chart is now identical to what's going on in OLAP because they have the same amount of data because it's pulling from the same data model. Okay, so that's really handy, but here's where the really good thing comes in about this particular technique. If I come back over here now and say, give me 20 values, So this is all the values in the data set. And I now go and say data refresh all. At this point, it's going to go back, it's going to reload the data. And now, I will say with this particular data set that I'm using, this is subtle and it's actually hard to see, okay? But if you take a really close look at where these guys are here, you can see the small little line above the table. You don't actually see that over here because the values have actually changed a little bit, okay? Over here, you can see that these guys are a little bit different as well. Where the real difference is coming in though, how do we actually know for sure? We scroll down, this guy here is based on a lot more data because it's actually pulling everything out of the data model in place where, of course, the OLAP formula, we would need to go and actually expand this thing manually in order to make it happen. Okay? So this is a couple of different approaches, well, 3 different approaches. Only 2 of them I think would be considered, good. But it's just different ways to look at it. So if you run into, short synopsis of this is if you run into a problem and you get told that you can't create a chart against the data model, you can try it with OLAP or try it with the DAX table. The challenge with this though is it's a little bit tricky to go and actually build this particular stuff, particularly because you've got to if you're not used to working with DAX, number one is on the rare occasion that you need to do this, you got to remember how the heck do I actually do this. And then the second part is you got to remember to put your evaluate function in front. And if you're not used to doing that in DAX, because you generally don't have to in your DAX formulas inside Excel, that's a trick to try and remember. And then it's trying to remember how to get these things into the right order. The other challenge that I run into when working with these guys here, and I'm going to show you some of the problems that we run into, is that what happens is it's very, very easy as you're adding new columns here to fracture the values, and all of those get charted. So that can become a little bit of a problem. In this particular setup right now, we actually have 4 columns of data, but I only actually need 3 of these. Now, I'm probably going to break my chart when I try and do this, but what I could do is I could actually go into this and I could actually modify my DAX statement. Okay, so I could come back in and say, let's go back into edit DAX. Right now, I'm evaluating the results of the entire table, but I don't actually need to do that. I could go with a summarize, if I can spell it correctly, summarize column. And then what I would do is I would actually go in and tell it the names of the columns that I actually wanted. So in this case here, I would want result F and copy that. We would go and get the result buffering. And then the trick is for the actual measure itself, what you do is you put in refresh time S, okay? You put it in quotes. I know it's a little bit hard to see, it's kind of small, but the name of the measure goes in quotes, and it also goes in square braces before we finally close off the parenthesis. And if I've managed to spell all of my DAX right here with no IntelliSense and typing it all in front of a live audience, always a suspect way to do things. If I go and say, okay, fantastic. Refresh times can't be determined. All right, you know what? I'm going to do this. This is the challenge I have with this. Trying to get this stuff exactly right is always tough. So you know what? I'm going to cheat. And here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to go use monkey tools because we've actually got a feature that we're actually working. This is still in beta. It's not out there in the public. But we've got an ability to actually insert DAX query tables into the workbook. So we actually pull up something that shows all these things, but we can also modify the existing DAX tables. So here's the DAX table for query 1, which looks like this. This is what I actually wrote in this. So if I were to come back and say, hey, you know what? Oh, you know what? It wasn't refresh time, was it? I'm going to get rid of that. So let me just go and put this one as time. There we go. It'll actually rewrite this thing for me. So it says, look, you want the, what do you actually want in this? Let's go and put in test. I'm actually going to move this. This is why this isn't live. We need to come up with ways to make this a little bit easier to move, but we're going to put in test, buffering, and then inside here again, the name of the measure. I put in a column instead of my measure, but the name of the measure first and in quotes and then in square braces. And now if I go back and say update, it will update the DAX table. Of course, I've moved some columns around on this, so that's actually blown up the chart. But if I were to go back now and say, hey, let's go grab these 2 guys here and insert and build me up my box and whisker chart, you can see that it's come back to life here. Okay, so This is a feature that we're working on right now, is building something to make it a little bit easier to actually create those DAX tables. And I'm going to show you a demo of that as we go through into the next here as well. So that's the first example. Now, I do have a completed example of this that is included in the zip file that I've actually shared with folks. The next example file that I'm going to be working with here is not included in the downloads. I will not be sharing this one. The reason being is because this is a work in progress of some stuff that I'm actually playing around with for working with general ledgers and trial balances and whatnot. But I do want to show you really quickly just the background of this before we jump into this. The idea here is that I'm actually building up a listing of general ledger transactions, and I've got something that actually allows me to dynamically generate this based on a whole bunch of parameters and whatnot. So if you're an accountant, you would understand this. If you're not, you probably won't, but don't worry about it for right now. The big key thing is the data model itself is actually not super difficult. Fernando likes that idea. All right. The concept behind this one is not super difficult. We have a transactions table. Okay, all the debits and credits are in here. The entire thing should sum to 0 at the end. I got a few different measures, and I've got a chart of accounts that I've got set up, a description of the general ledger transactions, a calendar table, and some customers. Try and actually get something so that I can build up virtually any kind of statement that I'm actually looking for. That's the be-all, end-all behind this, but it's not ready yet. Okay. There's two measures here that I'm going to be playing with as I go through and actually start doing my charting, and I'll show you these with Monkey Tools as well, just to give you a quick idea as to what's going on. Now, I'm going to show you the easier part, and I'll just give a quick hat tip to the hard part in a second. The thing to recognize about the data here is that all revenues are stored as negative numbers in a financial database, and all expenses are stored as positive numbers in the financial database. In addition, all assets are stored as positive, and liabilities and equity are stored as negative. The measure that I'm working with here, called actual, is summing my transactions, and then it is using something to do a smart sign switch. And basically what that does is it basically takes the sum of the sales, but it actually flips it so that everything shows up as positive. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that it does an absolute. It doesn't. So you can end up having refunds in something. Those would show as negative. But it gives me positive numbers for reporting. Okay. Now, I actually have taken this to one further level. You can see that that actual gets involved in things here. But I have an actual dollar, which is a lot more complicated because this one's actually dealing with retained earnings, current earnings, monthly balance sheets. There's all kinds of stuff here, but the real deal is there's some secret sauce on this thing here that is actually working with the actual component to make that a little easier. I also have another measure which is called sales H2O, and sales H2O is basically taking sales, which is just the simple sum of transactions amount again, and it's multiplying it by -1. So the idea behind this is that all revenues that are negative will now become positive, and all expenses that were positive will now become negative, because I'm going to need that for my waterfall chart. So that's sort of the concept behind what we're actually dealing with here. Now, the first chart that I'm going to build here is one that I actually used to discover that I have some issues in my data, which is why I'm not going to be sharing this thing. So it's not my first and favorite chart to go to. I am actually going to create a Sunburst chart, not, as I say, my favorite, but at the same time, sometimes it's useful in certain cases, and this is one of them. So to start with, I am going to need a DAX table for this. So I'm going to go to my pivot and filter. I'm going to use Monkey Tools to cheat on this one. And I could absolutely go and create a table that loads from Power Query to the data or to the worksheet and then do this manually, but I'm lazy or efficient or whatever. So I'm going to make myself a new table here called Sunburst. And the fields that I'm actually looking for here, I want account name, and I want class, and I want group, and statement, and I want year. You can see that every one of those is just being added as I check the boxes on the side here. And I know Abdullah's on the call here. He's worked really hard on helping me get data types and all kinds of cool stuff in here. All the measures are highlighted in yellow here. So we're going to go and we're going to grab actual dollars here. So this is basically picking this whole thing up. This is all editable if you wanted to. If you only want to pick up, say, the top 10 rows, you can actually put that right in here, and it puts your top end in for you. But we want everything, so we're going to get rid of that. And as I say, the one thing that we got to try and figure out is how to make it easy to reorder these things so that they get added in the right order and whatnot. But for right now, I'm just going to move things around manually. So we're going to say create. And there we go. We've got our nice little DAX table in place. So that did all the work of linking it to from the data model to the worksheet, right-clicking it, changing it to the command type of DAX, editing the DAX to put it in. And just to prove that out, if I go to table and edit DAX, here's the DAX statement. Okay, so we're just automating that process for you. Do it manually, do it with Monkey Tools. It's a free feature, or it's going to be when it's released. It's up to you. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to move some things around on this one because I don't like the order of what we got. So in order to start it properly, I want this to go statement. I want this next one to go year. And then we are going to go with class, group, and account name. So that's the order that I want to have my columns in for charting. I'm then going to go to data, and I need to do a little bit of sorting here to get things into the right order. So the sort order I'm looking for is by class first, and then by group, and then by account name, and finally by the year. And there we go. So this puts all the data into the correct format. One of the cool things that I love about having data in tables, even if they're not linked to a pivot table, this is also cool, is that we can now go and use splicers on them. And I believe this changed in Excel 2016, but it might have been 2019. I can't remember for sure. Been doing this too long. But basically, I'm going to add a slicer for statement and for year. If you're not familiar with the terms that we're playing with here, BS stands for balance sheet in this vernacular. IS stands for income statement, but you can make those then be whatever you like. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my data from class. Let's go and grab it from class all the way across to actual. And I'm going to go to insert. And I'm going to insert a chart that could not be built against the pivot table. And that is the Sunburst chart here. A couple things I need to do on this one. Snap it up here. We're going to go all the way down to I-30. That makes it big enough for me to see what I want to see. And then, and this is super important if you're going to do filtering, right click, format chart area, go to the widget here that apparently is size and properties, open the properties. Oh, buried. Don't move or size with cells. If you do that, as you start filtering and your things start disappearing here, it won't change the size of your chart. Okay, I wish this was on by default. Anyway, now, this looks like a mess, okay? If my friend Joseph Yates was here, he'd be freaking out right now because, I mean, this is like a three-layer pie chart, which is like I mean, that's 3 layers of nightmare right there. But the cool thing about this is that I can actually use this to get some interesting information. So I'm going to slice this by down to 2019, and I'm going to slice into balance sheet. Now, the interesting thing around this particular data set here is that this looks up. Okay? And the reason that I'm saying that is because the whole purpose of a balance sheet is that your assets must always equal liabilities and equity. So when I look at this, this line should always be straight up and down inside here. There should be half on one side and half on the other. The other thing that's kind of interesting about the Sunburst is that I can break my assets down and say, hey, you know what? There's more capital assets than there are current assets. All of my capital assets are equipment. My current assets are broken between bank and inventory. When I look at my liabilities and equity, it looks like most of what I have is actually debt in the form of a bank loan. Don't have a lot of equity, although everything I do have is share capital, and I've got a little bit of liability here. And this is where things are going to go a little sideways on me, because I'm going to move to 2020. And if you look at this carefully, you can see that these two lines are not straight up and down anymore. So something I've done inside my data model is not adding up anymore, and it needs to be. Now, I have a feeling that it may have something to do with the negative values that I have in here for the retained earnings, because one of the big things around the chart here that we're actually playing with is you can only chart positive values in a Sunburst. So that could be it, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'm going to have to look at that, because if that's the case, then I would need to actually come up with a way to state these things differently, reclass these things so that they become, you know, assets or liabilities depending on what's actually going on. Regardless, I can actually see some interesting things that have actually happened here. In my assets, I have much more in the way of current assets as a proportion of my assets now versus before, where I had mainly capital. Most of it is bank, so cash, which is good. I must have sold some stuff and brought in some money. When I look at the liabilities and equity side, long-term debt is a much smaller proportion of what I have. The share capital is shrunk as an overall proportion. Current earnings is massive. So it looks like I've done fairly well this year. And if I look at 2021, again, my balance is a little bit off here. You know, I'm convinced actually this has to do with the negative numbers on this one, but regardless, I mean, you can see that now my equity is being broken down. Share capital, my current earnings is small, but I've got a really big retained earnings portion here. So it just gives me some interesting ways to look at things. The whole concept behind these particular charts is all, of course, about proportions and knowing what's bigger, what's smaller. It's not about knowing absolute values. But the interesting thing about this particular chart is that the DAX table actually lends really, really well to driving something like this. Why not an OLAP table? Because the OLAP table's boundaries get constrained. If I add a new chart of accounts item and I hit refresh on this, it will show up. If it's in an OLAP state, it won't, which means that this won't necessarily work properly. Okay, so that's kind of a key thing to sort of recognize about this. So I would definitely use a DAX table to drive this one. Again, you know, it needs to plot positive values, so I've got to come up with a way to actually solve that particular issue, because that's just the way that the Sunburst chart works. One other challenge to be aware of when you're driving things from your DAX-based table, you'll notice that I used a slicer for my year. I actually way prefer timelines. I can't use a timeline against a DAX table. Even though the field is formatted as a date inside PowerPivot, when it lands into Excel, it lands as a number. And even if you format it as a date, it doesn't matter. It's still, the timeline will not read it. And that's a real shame. The other side of it, though, is that if you really wanted to get down to the point where you're slicing by great granularity, you would actually need to pull down every single row of data. Now, if you've got massive data sets, that's obviously a problem, because you're going to run out of row capacity if you're over 1 million rows, or it could be really slow to load. The second thing is that it over fractures the data, and if all of those data points get plotted, it can make your chart unreadable. Okay? So those are some of the challenges that you can run into to that particular technique. Now, regardless, for right now, I should also show you income statement too while I'm here. This is kind of interesting because in my first 2019, you can see that my revenues are a much smaller proportion than my expenses. That means I'm losing money. That's not good. Now, there's a reason for that. This business that I've got as the sort of mock startup here actually started selling in December. But one of the things around the amortization of their capital assets based on the rules that are in play for their tax years, I told you this is all heavy accounting stuff here. They actually have to claim an entire half year of amortization in the first year that they purchased their assets, even though they were only in business for a month. That overwhelms their revenues. So we know about that. But the next year, now revenues are a much bigger proportion. Okay, so there's lots of cool stuff that's going on there, and then we can sort of see the breakdown. So it's kind of an interesting chart to play. So let me just rename this one here. We're going to call this one Sunburst, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and look into our last chart type that we're going to play around with. You know, it's funny. Like I said, I don't know if it's going to go 45 minutes or an hour and a half. I should have known. I never go 45 minutes in any presentation. But here's what's going to happen. We're going to go and call this one Waterfall. And I'm going to try and spell that with a W because that is kind of the way that Waterfall make 2 L's. There we go. All right. For the waterfall chart, I'm going to do something different. I'm not going to use a DAX table. I find it too difficult to use the DAX table for this. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here. We're going to insert a new pivot table from the data model. Here we go. And in this pivot table, I'm going to go to my chart of accounts, and I'm going to put my filters. I'm going to throw a statement on here. The only thing I'm interested in doing my waterfall on is my income statement. So I'm going to filter that right off the bat. The next thing that I'm going to do is on rows, most accurate pie chart. I don't know about that, man. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to put my group on rows, and I'm going to put my account name on rows as well. And then I'm going to go to my transactions table here, and I'm going to put my sales H2O on values. And what you can see now is my revenues are being reported positive. My cost of goods sold, all of my other operating expenses are being reported as negative. Okay. So this is good so far, but there are some challenges that I need to deal with, one of them being the design of the pivot table. So we're going to go tabular. We're going to go repeat all item labels. Now, in this case, I actually want the grand total. It's unusual for me on these things, but the challenge, of course, is that if I now go and say, hey, I want to take this, well, here's one challenge. I really want to mark this as net income, but I can't change this part of the pivot table. That's kind of frustrating. So I'll try and chart this as a waterfall chart to see what I get. So I'm going to go insert, waterfall. Here we go. Can't do it. Never mind. OLAP to the rescue. Okay, so here we go. Pivot table tools, analyze, convert formulas. I'm going to convert the report filters as well, just because. And at this point, I now get a set of data. Now, based on the time that we're at, I'm not going to go through on this one here and flatten all the formulas. I don't actually need to for this particular scenario, although if I were releasing this as a real scenario, I absolutely would. But what I am going to do is I'm going to make some changes to this thing. I'm actually going to insert a new row right here, and I'm going to call this one gross profit. And in order to get the gross profit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the subtotal function, deliberate, and we're going to go and subtotal the two items just above. Okay, I'm going to grab all this data and we're going to go and just drop those down so we're looking at whole numbers. Okay, now, so this is an OLAP formula. This is an OLAP formula. This is a subtotal formula that has nothing to do with OLAP whatsoever. It's just subtotaling these guys up. The most important thing to realize, though, is what's going on with this formula. Because this is not the sum of the items above, nor am I going to make it the sum of the items above. I'm going to leave this as it is. And there's a very, very good reason for this. When I look at the formula that we have here, it's retrieving the income statement, the sales H2O, and it's picking up grand total. And if I go and look at the grand total formula, you can see that it's plainly referring right here to grand total for the group. So it's picking up everything. That means that this formula, no matter what is showing as far as cubes above or what account there, is always going to return the net income or loss, which is perfect. I can use that to my advantage now to go and add a flag to watch out if there's any issues. So I can say, hey, let's put in a missing account, and we'll write a little formula to go and check that. So we're going to say if, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with, again, a subtotal 9, and I'm going to subtotal the entire range of data and divide it by 2. The reason why I use subtotal here is that when you use a subtotal and you actually pick up any nested subtotals within it, it doesn't count this and this and this. It says, oh, this was subtotaling the data above it, so I'm only going to put that information in once. So basically it says I'm going to sum this entire range, but I'm going to ignore the subtotal here. I've summed the entire range, which includes all the detail plus the total. If I divide that by 2, that should equal the grand total. If it does, clear, we've got all of our accounts. If it doesn't, that means we are missing accounts, and we want somebody to know about it. All right, so it's all clear right now, everything's working. But what if, for example, there was a $75,000 rent item that didn't show up? We're missing accounts. So we get a flag. It doesn't tell us which ones, but at least we know what they are, or at least we know something's missing. Okay. Now, last thing I'm going to do here, we're going to go to net income or loss. And I just realized that I made a horrendous mistake here when I did this thing too, and that is that I forgot to put something in place. So let me just see if I can actually fake this thing out really quick and work this backwards. Oh, not like that, Ken. Now I'm panicking. So we're going to go and we're going to add one of these guys here. What I want to do is I want to go to my calendar and I want to add a timeline. All right. So we have a timeline here. I'm just going to go and throw some transactions on this thing just so I've got something. And then I'm going to convert this to OLAP. Bingo. And now I'm going to look at this. There we go. It's timeline date. That's what I'm actually looking for. So I'm going to come back to here. And I'm going to go down this guy here. Now, normally, as I say, I would have flattened this, so this would actually make this super, super easy. But I'm going to go and add my timeline date on every one of these in a hurry. Yuck, this is just nasty. You know what? Let's do it this way. Control H. And what we're going to do is we're going to replace that with that. That's more efficient. There we go. So we've now got this link to the timeline. I'm going to set that to years. Okay. Don't need this anymore. All right. Actually, I don't need the headings. I'm just going to grab the data here. We're going to go insert waterfall chart. Okay, so the data is based against the data model. We've now got a waterfall chart. There is some challenges with this guy though. The way the waterfall chart works, if you're not familiar with it, we've increased revenue to $659,000. We draw a line straight across. We've decreased by 230,000 for the cost of goods sold. That tells us that we then draw a line straight across. We should be at 428,000. The problem is my gross profit is being added to that as if it's income. It's not. This is actually a subtotal. I'm going to grab this once, twice to grab just the data point, right click and set as total. So we've now gone up to 659, dropped 230 to come to 428, and now we can see the teardown of all the other expenses that are actually costing me money until I get to my net income at the end. Beautiful. Why this is so cool is because this is all driven from the pivot or from the OLAP formulas. And now when I go and say filter to 2020, it works. Filter to 2021, it worked. Filter to 2019. Now this has a little bit of weirdness to it. We don't have a lot of customization ability with the built-in waterfall charts. If you want customization for your waterfall charts, John Peltier has a Peltier Tech add-in, which he does waterfall charting, and I'm pretty sure he can do this. I would love to be able to change the color of the axis to a dark black so you can actually see it, because the zero axis is right here. And basically what this is saying is we're starting from zero. Our direct expenses took us here. We had 3,700 bucks of profit, and then we actually tore this all the way down through the other things. The other thing that I can't do is I can't hide the irrelevant items like utilities, property tax, and building maintenance. They're going to show up. I've tried attaching to this with dynamic arrays. This would not work. So the reality is on this is that, this still is working the way it's supposed to. It's just a little bit confusing. I wish I could format this to be in a different color to indicate that this is down from the axis. It's still a subtotal, which is great, but it is a loss, right? Regardless, though, the cool thing about this, and this is what I really love about this particular set of data. Check this out. We can now go and say, oops, let me bring that where I can see it. Let's change this to quarters. I can report on quarters. I can report on months. If you want December and January that go over my year end, no problem. I can even, if the data in the data model is at a granular enough level, report on individual days. Of course, I would pick 2019 when I don't actually have any. So let me go over here for a second to 2020. And let me go into, I don't know, let's go somewhere a little bit more. February, how about that? Bingo, there we go. We got some data in February. So we're getting right down, February 1st through 5th. We can actually see it in the waterfall chart. I mean, this is cool, right? Just kind of a neat little technique. Some thoughts on this one here. I would definitely not do this in a DAX table. You can use the DAX summarize table function in order to go and add things like roll-ups and subtotals and things like that. But the problem is that it adds a whole bunch of data that has empty cells in it and whatnot, and it tries to chart those. It's really, really hard to do. This is a scenario where OLAP makes a lot more sense. And if you've got a little flag on this that you check, I mean, I usually collect all kinds of different checks when I'm building financial statements onto a central dashboard so that when we do a refresh, I can tell, is everything still in balance? And if it's not, then at that point, at least I can go through and say, hey, you know what? Okay, this is a challenge. I know that I need to go and fix something. Where's the problem? And I can go and find it. Okay, so the DAX table, not the best example or not the best use case for this one. The OLAP formula is absolutely the best place. The other thing, it is difficult, if not impossible. I say that now. I should probably ask Matt about it next meetup, but it's difficult, if not impossible, to insert only some subtotals in DAX. I want a subtotal on my gross profit between revenue and cost of goods sold. I do not want a subtotal after operating expenses. At least if I did, I would want a subtotal, which is basically my net income. I do not want a subtotal of the operating expenses because it doesn't actually lend well in a waterfall chart, because it's not subtotaling from here to here or from here all the way through. It's subtotaling individual items, so it doesn't work as well. Okay, so as I say, this is a place where the OLAP chart type is better for this particular scenario. Now, I'm going to move out of this thing. I'm going to run through the end of what I actually have here. All of these things are actually included in the deck as well, that as at the link that we will share. DAX tables work really well when your data requirement is a simple table. When the axis items need a dynamic refresh, so if you're adding a new category and you need to refresh and that category shows up and needs to be in the chart, that is a great time to actually use a DAX table. The drawbacks of your DAX table: difficult to add subtotals in it. Timelines won't recognize dates from DAX tables at all. And additional dimensions, the more you add, let's say that you want to do sorting, let's say that you want to do filtering, and you're adding more and more columns in there to get that, they can fragment your data and therefore end up having additional data points show up and be plotted, which may not be what you want. Okay, so that's some of the challenges along the way there for those. To create a DAX table, easy way, change the load destination of a query to both table and the data model. Right-click the table, edit DAX, change the command type to DAX, and then update the formula to one of the following formats. Evaluate and the table name, that'll give you the entire table. Evaluate top n, x or n, comma, the table name would give you the top x records. Or if you actually want to get into getting specific items here, you would do a summarized column. You put in your dimension table name before, and then a square brace, and then dimensional column name, followed by a comma. You can do as many of them as you want. And then I haven't actually tried, but I believe that the measures actually need to be at the end, not in the middle. Your measure names, you can put anything you want between the quotes. Typically, I just use the same measure name because I named it that for a reason. But between the square brace, it must be the official measure name. Okay, so that's the secret to getting those done. There's obviously other options that you can use if you go into summarize, where you can actually start using roll up and his subtotals and things like that. I'm not going to get into that; they're rarely used. But if that's your jam, it will work. Okay. OLAP cube formula for charting. These work really, really well when your data boundaries are predictable. They're not going to be expanding on a regular basis, or where you need really granular control of your data. And I think that's probably one of the things that's most important to recognize about the data sample that I actually worked with here. I injected a new row into the middle of my data set. That's really hard to do in a pivot table without adding a whole new column to go through and actually set up the right way and whatnot. If I wanted to scatter this around all over the place because I had a different charting format, maybe something like a bullet chart that requires data in different columns and different stuff like that, I can do it with OLAP formulas. If I had more time, I would have come up with a bullet chart example. But unfortunately for this one, I didn't. But hey, this is a cool thing. The data doesn't have to be in that same rectangular block. OLAP formulas give you that ability for that granular control. If you want to use a timeline, the timeline can be hooked back to the original data model, which means that it doesn't have to be in a table. Okay, so that's what timelines are for. So if you're doing that, the big secret on this one, well, I'll give you the drawbacks on this thing here first, and we'll talk about the big secret about the timeline on the next slide. The drawbacks, the axis items are dynamic. If you get new axis items, they don't get added. You got to do it manually. Visible recalculation in the spreadsheet is also kind of gross. When you do a refresh, particularly if you have a big model on this, it actually throws up a bunch of half marks all the way across your cells as they're recalculating. That can be very, very visually disconcerting. There's no way to get rid of it that I'm aware of. You don't see that when you're dealing with a pivot table. But overall, as long as you don't have an entire spreadsheet full of them, it's not usually too bad. That's another reason why I actually go and flatten my stuff down. It makes things a little bit faster. It doesn't have to recalculate quite as many cells as it's going through. Creating your OLAP cube formulae, and I'm going to need to go and actually update this slide after the note that I got here from Daniel. So thanks for this, but this will work still. Create and configure your pivot table. You go to pivot table, OLAP tools, convert to formulas. Again, this will only work if your pivot table is based on cube formulas or based on a data cube. So Power Pivot is an example of that, and that's why it works here. Optionally, you can flatten the formula down if you want to. This is generally the structure, although as Daniel says, you don't need to actually put in the entire cube value function. You can actually just put in the table, column one, and value components of it. Having said that, this is sort of the most robust way of explaining it or putting it out there, I guess. But I intend to shorten this slide down a little bit. The key things that I want you to recognize about what you actually have going on in this, every bolded and italicized value in this is variable. You fill this in with what you want to be there. Anything that is not bolded is not. So when you look at things like measures, for example, this is an actual hard-coded static word. We always use measures when we're dealing with a measure. It doesn't matter what table they're stored on. Whereas if you're picking up a specific column, it's important to put the correct table name in front of it. Okay? You have the ability to get as granular as you want with this, so you don't actually have to put in everything that your cube function always gives you, just the stuff that actually matters. So if I'm looking at, a chart of account classification that's got a group of revenues, and then I've got an account underneath it that's called green fees, I wouldn't have to put in revenues and green fees. But if I have the same account name in both revenues and expenses, then I better. Otherwise, if I just put in that one account name, I'll get the account for both the revenues and expenses all rolled up in one line item. If I actually put in both components, that would help filter it down. Okay, so slices and timelines can be added to this. The big secret here, don't forget to add your slices and timelines before you convert to OLAP formula. That way you actually get the name of the timeline and it just works when you sync it up. It also allows you to create the timeline when you've got a pivot table. Otherwise, it's going to ask you where do you want to put it from. It just makes life so much easier to bind it to a pivot table before you convert it to OLAP so that it actually comes into the actual formula right up front. All right, so I ran a bit over time on this one. I do want to just sort of throw out, just as a sort of final closing here. This is actually the first run of this thing. I actually plan on doing a lot more work and making this a little bit cleaner and with better examples, and actually getting it into this product at some point in time. But right now, this product is already massive. There's all kinds of good stuff, as Kristen said. This is a great course to actually learn a whole bunch of stuff. One of the cool things too, we've always included a copy of my book in here, and the new edition is going to be out very, very soon. That will be included to everybody who is also registered on this. So if you're looking for training with coaching, where you get to meet with us, after your full training for a couple hours every month at your option, to try and ask questions about how to do things in your own world with your own data, that's what we do here. So if you're interested, check it out. Still a couple more days to go before we kick off the next semester. There will be another one afterwards, and you honestly can start anytime. But this one is getting ready to go right now. And if you're interested in seeing some of the stuff like Monkey Tools, where we will be eventually releasing that feature to build DAX tables into the free version of the product, there's a few different places where you can find out about it, but the top right link is the one that will get you to Monkey Tools, where you can download a free trial to check out what's actually there. The other places, my blog, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, all those social media places are places where you can hook up with us. And of course, you can always, reach us through the meetup site and things like that as well. That is basically the run of the presentation that I've got for y'all today. I don't know if there's any questions that anybody wants to throw in. If you do, please feel free to fire them into the chat or to come off of mute and ask. I'm more than happy to take comments and whatnot. I see, let me see here. What do I see? Oh, a comment from Chris. Thanks. Incredible session, brain doing the thing it does. You're welcome. I have to say this was a fun one. Full disclosure, this presentation got finished about an hour before this thing actually took on. So I wanted to do something new, but my time has just been so focused on the book, trying to get it all done over the last little bit here, that this was a bit of a rush. But hopefully it came across nicely and explained some good stuff and gave you guys some options. I mean, that's what this is really all about, is once you get hit with that awful error message that you can't make a pivot chart out of it, don't believe it. There's a way. You just got to get a little bit creative on how it actually happens. So there we go. If there's no other comments or questions, folks, I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming. I will be posting the recording of this within the next 24 to 48 hours. I know that I always get a comment within about 5 minutes of the meetup ending of where is it. It'll be 24 to 48 hours. I got to get it down and do some edits and whatnot to post it, but it will be coming. The examples that were already posted, so you can always download them and check out the things that are there, as well as the slides. I particularly want to thank Daniel for the comment on the cube formulas. I will be making some modifications to this presentation before it actually gets into my boot camps and things like that. That's great. Love learning from you guys as well. And there we go. So thank you so much for coming. I will catch you in the next meetup. The registration for MATS is already open, so please make sure that you come and check us out in a couple of weeks. We'll see you then. Have a great one, folks, and stay safe out there.